It's rectangular in red with a black border, and it sits atop two parallel pieces of square black metal tubing that are separated by two cross members welded in place. The two vertical pieces are anchored securely into the ground. It's been relocated, and you can still see where the grass over the disturbed soil has not yet regrown. Next to it is a bronze plate on the ground that looks oxidized. There are flowers of all different shapes and colors: white, blue, yellow, and most noticeably, pink. They aren't real and are made to hold up to the changing weather. Some are set into the grass above it, and most are in a metal vase. The sun is out of the south and casts their shadow to the north. Barely visible next to its top, and hidden between flowers and leaves of grass, is a small, rusted piece of rebar that sticks out of the ground. It's one of two that are still present to this day, and they are left as a reminder of what transpired in the darkness between March 14th and March 15th, 2020, when someone ripped the metal stand from its rebarred foundation and threw it to the side. The placard on the stand is a heavenly prayer asking the person or persons who know what happened to Tammy to finally speak up and end the silence, and it rests next to Tammy's grave. On March 14th, 2020, friends and family gathered to remember Jed Thuy, one of Eric Stukel's closest friends, and Eric was in town. This is the Footsteps in the Dark podcast, Season 1, Tammy Haas, Episode 5, and I'm your host, Chad Zimmerman. When we left off the last episode, Eric Stukel had been charged with manslaughter in the death of Tammy Haas. But it was what happened just days before that left me scratching my head. With Dave Hanoff from Yankton County, Detective Mike Mosier from the Yankton Police Department, and Ron Hilges from the Nebraska State Patrol, authorities confronted Eric Stukel and tried to get him to admit to lesser charges, the improper disposal of a body, rather than manslaughter charges. Eric turned them down and instead offered to take a second polygraph. It seemed to me that warning Eric of different questions might have contributed to his not showing up, and I wondered if they blew their shot. I wanted to know more about this kind of situation, so I called former Sheriff's Deputy Shane Kopel.
I was an IPTM guy and not a Reed guy, but everybody I know at that time, Reed was kind of I think that Reed was the preferred technique, and it really kind of irritated the folks from Institute of Police Technology Management when, people would point out, well, I've heard that the Reed course was a good course. But, Sheriff Hanoff was, a student of the Reed course, and a number of our other deputies were as well. I hadn't gone through the course, but I believe it's a pretty effective course.
Have you ever heard much about it, being responsible for a disproportionate amount of false confessions?
The Reed technique or IPTM's technique or any interview or interrogation, procedure is subject to the interpretation of the interviewer, reading the responses of the person that they're interviewing. And, I can't really speak to, one being more effective than the other. I was an IPTM guy, but I know that Sheriff Hanoff, was a Reed graduate or had studied that technique.
Give me some perspective on what you think was going through Dave's mind going into this thing, and kind of how it all kind of shook out.
Well, I think as the case and the investigation continued to develop, I think everybody realized that it seemed that probably the last person to have been with Tammy or have seen Tammy was Eric. There was the Jennifer Jones statement that she had seen Tammy. I didn't give much credibility to that, and I don't think a lot of people did. I'm not sure if the sheriff did or not. But for the most part, I believe everybody kind of felt that, she was with Eric at the time of her death. So, as the investigation continued, each department kind of developed their own lead person on it. For the sheriff's office, it was Sheriff Hunoff, and I think the police department went from Detective Miller to Detective Mosier. In Nebraska State Patrol, I believe, was probably Ron Hilligus or Jerry Krieger. But in any event, the thought that was developed was that nobody really knew how or where she died, and I know that the Nebraska law enforcement was coming up on a deadline for their statute of limitations on manslaughter. By that time, I wasn't actively involved in the case. However, I know that law enforcement was at the point where they simply wanted to know what had happened, and I can't speak to what the prosecutor or any of the other officers involved in the case were doing, but I believe that when they charged him, I thought that perhaps that would encourage him to come forward and explain what actually happened. And unfortunately, I think it just kind of painted him, or at least he felt it painted him into a corner. He was represented by Mike Stevens, and I thought Mike did a pretty good job of defending the case, where law enforcement couldn't prove how or where she died.
Going back to when they approached him before he was charged, what would be some of the reasoning behind coming at him and saying, well, it's an accident, and if you just tell us, then we be looking at nothing more than, say, the improper disposal of the body type of charge? Do you feel like that was kind of a serious approach, or do you think that was part of the REAP technique and they were just trying to get him to take a step forward with things?
Well, I think that there probably were some in the law enforcement community who believed that, this was an intentional homicide, but not so much the people who were involved in it on a day in and day out basis. I think that they probably really, simply wanted the truth. And, and I believe when they approached him like that, it may have been from the REAP technique, but I never really got the impression that they had decided whether or not it was an accident or whether it was, something where, he wasn't involved but was there. So I have the impression that when they approached him, I believe that was probably a legitimately them reaching out. However, it also, put him in such a situation that he didn't even want to get tagged at that point with dumping the body. He was, fully committed to, saying he wasn't involved at all. And I think that there was, his perception that, a number of people believed he wasn't involved at all, in spite of, everything pointing to the contrary.
I guess I have a question regarding, during this confrontation with Eric, when he kind of tells them no about things, they turn it towards the first polygraph that he showed deception on, and this kind of piqued his interest, and eventually led to a conversation about a second polygraph and something that Eric agreed to. But as they negotiate this out, they come at him and tell him that they're going to change the line of pertinent questioning to, from what it used to be, did you kill Tammy, to, was she alive or injured in any way the last time you saw her? What, being part of law enforcement, what would be your interpretation of what, why give that away at that point instead of just get him to the polygraph and then ask him the question?
Well, I know at the time that the feeling of law enforcement that simply the question, did you kill Tammy? That's a very strong question, and the word kill has a number of different, a number of different realities for people. It could be something where somebody saw a family pet die, in a horrible manner, and that's going to elicit a response. And I remember law enforcement wasn't very happy with that particular question on the original polygraph. And so, I don't know that Eric was all that concerned. Like I said, I didn't really work that part of it, but I do know that law enforcement wasn't happy with that question and wanted to see a new question come in. Now, why they would approach him with that, perhaps he had spoken to that, in saying that, that wasn't a good question, or perhaps he had, expressed, displeasure with the entire line of questioning. But, polygraphs simply, are used by law enforcement to determine, if you're going in the right direction. And, I feel that law enforcement thought they were going in the right direction. And of course, if you, can come up with some more clarifying questions, then obviously that's going to point you more in the right direction. So I think that was their intent as to why they shared that with him. I think that was simply to try to, calm some of his concerns and to try to get him back into the room and talk to them and, and tell them what actually happened. I just think that as I look back on it and as I thought about it, I do remember that question was something that nobody was happy with. And, I remember that there was some talk about, saying that, the whole, polygraph was no good, but we decided that wasn't really accurate either, and that wasn't something that we wanted to go with. The question they weren't happy with, but, the overall polygraph and the polygrapher was a seasoned and a good polygrapher. But, I think it was just one of those things that, Eric felt that he was painted in a corner and was gonna go down, making sure that he wasn't in any way, shape, or form tied to, not only Tammy's death, but to the disposal of the body.
With Eric's dismissal of the plea deal and failing to show up for the second polygraph, he sealed his fate by facing manslaughter charges. It would be the state of Nebraska versus Eric David Stukel. If you want to see the pursuit for truth in Tammy's case continue, please consider supporting us. You can do this in a number of different ways. First, you can join our Patreon site. This is where you'll find all of the in-depth analysis that went into our conclusions and lots of behind-the-scenes information. You can support us by buying merchandise, or you can donate. All of these options can be found on our website at footstepsinthedarkpodcast.com. And if you like the song by John Slap Myers, Tammy's Ghost, that we use at the end of each episode as a prelude to the next, please download it. It's just 99 cents and you can find it on iTunes. And as always, we thank you for your support. It really does mean everything to us. This podcast contains themes and language intended for a mature audience. Listener discretion is advised. Built in 1891 and listed on the National Register of Historic Places, the Cedar County, Nebraska Courthouse is easy to spot. Built in the style of Romanesque Revival architecture, the traditional reddish-orange brick stands out along with a large bell tower on its northwest corner. It's here where Eric Stukel would arrive for trial on manslaughter charges in the death of Tammy Haas. In 2017, 21 years after the trial, Nancy Haas's pleas for a transcript were finally granted, and she received several volumes of transcripts from the trial. However, the transcript is considered the intellectual property of the court reporter. With a warning on the first page, it tells us it is not to be copied or taken apart in any way, pursuant to the Nebraska Supreme Court rules. Thus, prior to last year, volumes had to be physically handed to those interested in reading them, causing most to only read part of the transcript and only having a partial understanding of the trial. Following several calls and emails, I learned that the court reporter, Cynthia Foley, had passed away tragically at just 57 years of age. As a result, we were granted permission to digitize the trial transcripts. Several months later, I was able to obtain a full copy of the Cedar County Court transcript that includes more than 500 pages of filings regarding the case. In this episode, we will go through the highlights of more than 2,000 pages of official records. On September 25, 1996, just 1 week after the 4-year anniversary of Tammy's death, and 1 day after Eric's 22nd birthday, jury selection would begin in the case of the State of Nebraska versus Eric Stukel. During this phase, both the prosecutor and the defense attorney cull through dozens of potential jurors before agreeing on a jury of 12 peers from Cedar County, Nebraska. The prosecution would be undertaken by attorneys David Arterburn and Bill Howland, and the defense by attorneys Mike Stevens and Lucy Luno. It's at this point that I wanted to point out something that surprised me, since I'd been told that Eric's ability for his family to afford him a great attorney helped him in the trial's outcome. Eric had actually been declared indigent by the state of Nebraska, and Mike Stevens was his court-appointed attorney. Thus, the state of Nebraska would be paying for both prosecution and the defense of Eric Stukel. The trial begins in close quarters with Judge Maurice Redmond, attorneys Arterburn and Stevens, and Eric Stukel. The purpose of the closed-door meeting was to inform Eric that there may be discussions held outside of the jury's ears, and that he is welcome to be present, or he can waive his attendance, which he agrees to do. Then, after a short break, jury selection would begin. Judge Redmond makes the typical opening statement to potential jurors about how the legal system is set up in the state and county, and delivers a generalized understanding of the court and explains to them that they were randomly selected and the process used to ensure randomness, such as if they draw the number 7 out of the box, then they select the 7th, 17th, 27th, 37th prospective juror, and so forth. They begin with a pool of 28 prospective jurors, and much of the transcript involves questioning of the jurors by the opposing counsels. As boring and as repetitive as it gets, during this phase, each side begins to frame the angle they're going to use, and it is each side's first opportunity to influence a jury. Attorney Bill Howland begins for the prosecution and asks if there is anyone that has experience with chemistry and biology, since much of the evidence in the case can be difficult for a layperson to understand. He wants to make sure someone with a science background is on the jury. He also takes this moment to tug on the heartstrings by asking jurors if they have children, and plant seeds in their minds about needing the ability to put things together, since much of the case is circumstantial. As I read through this part of the trial, it was clear that he was trying to find the weeds in the garden and pull them. He's trying to find the ripest fruit to keep. He repeats the phrase, "put it together," or "put the two together," and discusses terms like ingredients and pieces, repeating the concept about having to take circumstantial evidence and put it all together. During a break, 2 potential jurors are summoned to speak with opposing counsel and the judge regarding issues they may have serving on the jury. One of the prospective jurors lets the court know that he'd had a conversation with a businessman whose son was close to Tammy, and he's having a hard time presuming Eric to be innocent. Both opposing counsels and the judge ask questions, and the prospective juror continues to resist to acknowledge that he can be impartial, and it comes off as though he just really doesn't want to be on the jury. And Judge Redmond intervenes and says, quote, "What the presumption of innocence is, it's a rule of evidence, and it is in favor of the accused. That's evidence in his favor immediately from the start. It's like a cloak that is placed over the defendant. There's 2 people that wear a robe in the courtroom, the defendant and the judge. And that robe protects the defendant until the state proves its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt, each of these elements. And after that's done, you take the defendant and his robe into the jury room and you deliberate. And that robe is made up of the elements of the crime charged. And you snip those elements away, each one that's proved beyond a reasonable doubt. If you get done snipping that robe and there's nothing left, then you can find the defendant guilty. But if there's one little piece there, then you have to find him not guilty." Shortly after dismissing the potential juror, day 1 wrapped up. On the second day, defense attorney Mike Stevens began his questioning of potential jurors, and the angle of his introduction was quite different in contrast to the prosecution, in that he spent a lot of time trying to relate to the jury. He mentions his wife was a teacher and had Eric as a student, that he has 2 daughters, a beat-up brown car, with one of his kids' names on the license plate, and that he's never been involved in this kind of case before. It's almost like he's trying to match his anxiety with the prospective jurors. Stevens poured it on and tried to connect to the potential jurors, and then his angle became clear. Could people wipe the slate clean and be impartial? Or do they harbor feelings of guilt with regards to Eric already? He even borrows Judge Redmond's analogy about the presumption of innocence and the cloak. But he brilliantly tweaks it. He says, quote, even if we start with a long robe and end up with a jacket, that's what the presumption of innocence is, end quote. Little did the jury know that one item of evidence would be Tammy's denim jacket, and there'd be testimony about Eric's bathrobe. He uses another analogy to try and get it to stick by relating the presumption of innocence to a football game, where the ball starts at the 0-yard line and has to make it to the opposite end zone. This is something he would repeat directly to prospective jurors throughout the process of jury selection. He then pointedly tells the jury that he's going to ask them if they've heard anything about the case, and instructs them not to tell them what they've heard. His primary focus is taking biased mindsets out of the jury pool. In one example, a prospective juror tells him he's seen and read a lot of news on the case and is biased. Stevens asks him where the ball is on the football field, and the juror tells him it's at the 50-yard line. While some jurors would be eliminated for health issues or because of preconceived bias, eventually the jury was selected on the second day, and the trial began with the prosecution's case. Now, given the transcript is 1,517 pages long, we're not going to cover every element. And in this episode, I'm going to provide an overview of what transpired, the key evidence presented, interesting interactions or strategies, and the reasons why the trial ended the way it did. If you want to read the entire trial transcript, simply join our Patreon site, and you can find that by visiting footstepsinthedarkpodcast.com. It should be noted that trials are not all-inclusive from an evidentiary standpoint. Since trials are like chess matches between opposing counsel, a common occurrence is the omission of evidence, particularly if one side perceives an issue with something. Trials are a bit of a show being staged for a jury, and the directors, the attorneys, don't always know how things are going to play out, so they proceed with an element of caution. In a sense, trying to make sure they are protecting the case from the other side. As a result, a trial rarely puts forth all of the story. And sometimes they don't even play their best hand. As I read through this trial, there were times when I just couldn't understand why something was omitted, or why an important point was never brought forth. Looking through recently obtained court filings, some of the strategic plays can become apparent between the state and attorney Mike Stevens. By law, the state has to provide the defense with everything they have and vice versa. It's called discovery. This gives each side a chance to follow up and examine what the other side has. In early filings, Attorney Arterburn disclosed a potential witness list of 280 prospective witnesses and provided Attorney Mike Stevens with roughly 2 feet of records to have to sift through. Since the investigation had taken more than 3 years to develop evidence, the case starts with the prosecution holding all the cards, and the defense has to go through the entire deck and try to figure out what hand the state has, and reinvestigate the important elements. And they have just months to accomplish this as opposed to the years law enforcement and the Attorney General's office had to develop evidence. And while the defense is working through things, law enforcement continues to look for new evidence. For the defense, it is an uphill battle, and continuances are often granted, and were in this case. As the trial approaches, each attorney must finalize a list of people that will be subpoenaed, and this is where Stevens tried to turn the tables on the prosecution. While the prosecution filed for a mere 21 witness subpoenas, Stevens subpoenaed 85 people. While the true intent of doing this is unknown, many have speculated that by doing so, Stevens reduced the amount of people that would attend in support of the Haas family, giving the impression to the jury that there was more support for Eric than against him. During the trial, the state would call all 21 of its declared witnesses, while Stevens would call just 10 of the 85 to the stand. The remaining 75 potential defense witnesses were ordered to be sequestered from the trial and could not attend. Since many of these people were friends of Tammy, it would give the jury the appearance that there were more supporters on Eric's side than Tammy's. At least that was the perception conveyed in some of Tammy's friends after the trial's conclusion. And one of those friends was Marjo.
Stevens did a really good job because Stevens made it so none of Tammy's friends could be in the courtroom. So you had the defense side with Stukel's friends. There was, as far as I knew, there was no pictures of Tammy. Like, and I'm not saying like of her. I'm saying when she was alive.
Anything, right? Yep.
You know, to give her a personality. And when I got off the stand, I was crying, and I had walked out, and I saw my parents, and they were both crying because I was crying, and I told the ADA, I was like, I am so sorry. I started crying on the stand. I said, I was trying to be composed. You know, I was trying to do my best. And he was just like, no, he goes, I was glad that you cried. He goes, you're the only one that has shown emotion. And he goes, and they need to see that. They need to see that, you know, Tammy was important, that Tammy mattered. But I just remember feeling really bad because I had cried. And and Stevens didn't obviously ask me any redirects or rebuttal or whatever it's called, cross-examination, because he would have looked like an ass had he done it.
Sure.
And that's why I think he was pretty smart. He's a pretty smart guy. But it also precluded me from going back into the courtroom because I could be called at a later time. Keep the emotional, best friend out of the courtroom.
On the second day, the trial would begin and charges would be clarified to the jury. The charges against Eric Stukel were fairly broad and read as follows. Quote, the material elements which the state must prove by evidence beyond a reasonable doubt in order to convict a defendant of the crime of manslaughter are 1. That the defendant, Eric Stukel, without malice, caused the death of Tamara Haas. 2. That the defendant, Eric Stukel, did so unintentionally upon a sudden quarrel or while he was in the commission of an unlawful act or acts. 3. That said unlawful act or acts consisted of one or more of the following. That the defendant intentionally or knowingly caused serious bodily injury to Tamara Haas, or that the defendant intentionally or knowingly caused bodily injury to Tamara Haas with a dangerous instrument, or that he recklessly caused serious bodily injury to Tamara Haas with a dangerous instrument, or that the defendant intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly caused bodily injury to Tamara Haas, and, lastly, that he did so in Cedar County, Nebraska on or about September 17th or 18th, 1992. End quote. The state cast a wide net with its charges, that Eric Stukel either intended to or recklessly caused Tammy's death in Cedar County, Nebraska. The first witness called was Tammy's mother, Nancy. She testified that Tammy was very fit and in shape, having danced and run track for many years, that she was very conscious about her appearance and kept her clothing neat and clean. Elements that might be important as her clothing would be crucial evidence later in the trial. She was asked about Tammy's romantic life, and that she was aware Tammy had been dating Rob from Lincoln during that summer. But Eric was also an interest, and that Eric seemed to be more interested in Tammy than Tammy was in him, foreshadowing a possible motive for Eric's alleged actions to come later. She testified that Tammy had moved out of the house because she was often staying out too late, and this wasn't a good thing for her younger brothers to see. She had seen Tammy the day she went missing, and they went to JCPenney to get luggage, a gift that had been promised as part of her high school graduation the year before. Lastly, she testified that Tammy had not come home the night the state alleged something happened to her, and that Tammy had been living with her sister, Tammy's Aunt Vicky. Under cross-examination, Stevens brought out several details the state decided not to bring out, such as the time after the funeral that Eric voluntarily came over to Nancy's house.
Well, afterwards, no, that's right. He came here and he sat in the kitchen, and what he said to me, of course, looking down, he wasn't one to look at you. He said, Nancy, I didn't do it. Oh, and he wanted to go to her room, but I didn't let him do that.
And Stevens would bring up the time that Nancy was wired and met Eric at the park.
You got wired up.
Yes, I did.
Tell me about that.
You know, and you probably, Kirsten, now you know me. Yeah, that was difficult to do, but of course in my heart hoped that, if I got him by himself like that, and it was right out here in the park, and met him, and well, he was his same self, and what he came up with that day, that is what would be nice to have that conversation, because I totally don't remember. The only thing that I remember him saying is that, it must have been somebody that was just coming through town. That was who killed her. That was his response.
He brings up the fact that Tammy had been dating other people that summer, such as Sean Coles, and that Eric had been dating others too. Nancy was unaware, and the strategy here was to get Nancy to acknowledge that Tammy had many romantic interests, and that Nancy really didn't have a good idea what was going on with her in the last month of her life. But bringing up Eric's interactions with Nancy opened the door for the prosecution to introduce an event from earlier that summer. An event that put Eric's temper on full display. And this was a big win for the prosecution. The next witness was Rick Kukta, the off-work golf ball hunter that discovered her body. Much of the direct examination is mundane, about the sequence of discovery, reporting it to authorities and who showed up to the scene. Kind of boring stuff. But under cross-examination, Stevens really focused in on Rick's movements up and down the hill after discovering Tammy, and repeating that with authorities once they'd arrived, trying to plant a seed in the mind of jurors that will become important later down the road, to try and discredit future testimony about Eric's actions and statements when he was taken to the scene. When we look at the witness list for the prosecution, about half the witnesses were involved in the investigation: law enforcement, doctors, and forensic analysts, and the other half were character witnesses pertaining to Tammy and Eric. From here on, we're going to focus on the highlights of the state's case against Eric, and his defense, the verdict, and why the verdict was what it was, including a never-before-seen letter written after the prosecution met with the jury. The state was able to construct a timeline of Tammy's movement on that night, particularly at or around the time of the party. Dan Stevenson testified that he locked the farmhouse up around 11 or 11:15, and people were leaving, and when he left, there was just one black car present, which was not Eric's. Thus, Eric and Tammy had already left. The defense utilized the witness from the party to show that Eric and Tammy appeared to be getting along. Many of these details are in episode 2, so we won't cover all of that. There is one interesting piece of trial strategy that Stevens repeatedly used during his cross-examination that's worth noting. He tended to ask witnesses if they remember who Yankton High played in the homecoming football game, and if Yankton won. Since most couldn't remember, it allowed the defense to sow seeds of doubt about the memories of the witnesses. Next, Tyler Mahoney testified that he was at the party, and that Tammy didn't seem like her usual, vibrant self. But the most damning part of his testimony was seeing Eric at the car wash the next day with an unknown person. Eric standing at the side of the car looking at it, and the other person back near the trunk looking down. His testimony was to increase the jury's suspicion of Eric's guilt. After all, why would Eric be cleaning his car the day after she went missing? Stevens cross-examines him and gets him to admit he didn't actually see the car being cleaned out, which likely had little effect on the jury, since why else would you be parked by a vacuum at a car wash? He then gets Mahoney to talk about Jamie Horchak urinating in his car, and intimates that that would be the real reason Eric might be cleaning his car, but completely missed an opportunity. Eric and Tammy had planned a date that night at the Black Steer restaurant, and Stevens could have used that opportunity to ask Mahoney if he knew if Eric might have had a date that night or not, and thus was cleaning his car for the date, missing a perfect chance to counter the state's narrative. Later in the trial, however, Stevens would be able to make this point. Pivotal to the state's case was to try and intimate a motive. And the state's case was to try and show the on-again, off-again nature of the relationship, and that Eric seemed more about Tammy than Tammy was about Eric. Witness Travis Novak testified that the night before Tammy went missing, that he'd been driving around with Tammy and Eric, and had plans for the following night, the night she went missing, and they were to meet up and go to Vermilion to see one of their mutual friends, Marjo Swedin. Tammy confirmed she'd call him the next day, and Eric was present during this exchange. She never called, and this left Travis unsettled, and it wasn't like her. Further, there was no contact with her at all after that, helping to establish the state's timeline that whatever happened to Tammy likely occurred on Thursday night, September 17th, or early on the 18th. And the idea that she would have up and left without telling anyone was not like her. Travis, along with Marjo, would both testify about the odd occurrence that transpired in Eric's bedroom a day after she was reported missing. This was discussed in detail earlier, but it involved visiting Eric at his home and witnessing the shrine he'd put up in his room to Tammy, seemingly mourning her loss before she was even found, and being evasive regarding their questions, and listening to their song, Chloe Dancer by Mother Love Bone. He also mentions an upbeat birthday party for Eric just days after Tammy was found. But it was sometime after that, and before Travis moved away from Yankton, that he had another moment with Eric, and he testified that Eric thought law enforcement would find something that would send him to jail, and that he was complaining about his shoulder being out of place in the days following Tammy's discovery. When I read this, I remembered that Stevens had submitted a master list of dated interviews for each person as part of the discovery filings. So I looked up the date of Travis's interviews. He was interviewed 5 times between September 23rd, 1992, the day Tammy was found, and October 4th, 1992. Thus, within 17 days of Tammy's disappearance, Eric was complaining about his shoulder hurting. The clear intimation is that the prosecution was seeding suspicion in the jury's minds, and that Eric's shoulder hurting was related to whatever happened to Tammy. And this played right into the state's narrative with the next witness, Marjo Swedin, who testified that she'd recently had a conversation with Tammy about getting her life back together, and that Rob was a better choice for her than Eric. But Tammy wasn't sure how Eric would react to her breaking it off with him, suggesting to the jury that Tammy might have tried breaking up with Eric the night she disappeared, and Eric lost his temper and hurt her. The state's theory was taking shape. Tammy's disappearance was out of character for her. She was thinking of breaking it off with Eric, and was potentially afraid. Eric was seen cleaning out his car the day after she disappeared. He was acting like she was already dead, mentioning she was probably dead in a ditch somewhere to multiple people. He walked to the very area she was found without any prior knowledge, and that he was the last person that she was seen with. One witness, Mark Merrill, was brought into the judge's chambers and questioned outside of the jury on a specific event that he remembered from June of 1990. Tammy had left something at Eric's and went over to get it and saw a note sitting out that Eric had written. It said, "I want to fuck Tammy's cold body on a cold slab." The prosecution thought this directly applied to the case as it spoke to Eric's character, but Stevens objected that it was double, triple hearsay. The judge ruled against it being admitted to trial, and the jury would not be allowed to consider potentially damning evidence. The rest would really come down to the medical and forensic evidence, and we've covered a lot of that in earlier episodes. However, there were some interesting things that occurred at trial that are worth discussing. For instance, the hair fibers that law enforcement attributed to Tammy were never introduced into evidence. However, the trunk mat fibers, red plastic particles, and the yellow paint flakes were. Dr. Rena Roy testified about bodily fluids, the urine on the back of the pants, semen discovered on the vaginal swab, the lack of any semen on her underwear, and a small spot of urine on the back of Tammy's underwear that matched Eric's blood and secretor types. With the lack of DNA testing in 1992, the best she could testify to was the urine being consistent with Eric and not consistent with Tammy or the urine on her pants that came from Jamie Horacek urinating in the car. Dr. Roy's testimony on the lack of semen on the underwear was a major point in the trial, and Dr. Bennett also testified in that regard. If Eric and Tammy had sex, and she got dressed and walked the mile or more to the gas station, there'd be a near 100% probability semen would be detected on her panties. It wasn't, and it was a major blow to Eric's alibi that Tammy walked home that night. And although Stevens would try and mix his questioning up through confusion, and in some cases, flat out misrepresenting Dr. Roy's testimony, Dr. Roy was not easily tripped up and was a strong prosecution witness regarding fluid evidence.
Well, Rena Roy's testimony was just the one that really threw me. She was the one that did all the testing, non-screeder, screeder, and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And the fact that there was, he's claiming that they had sex that night, but yet there's nothing on her underwear.
Right.
There was no, none of her urine, and there was no semen. And I just can't imagine if I had sex with someone that night. One, most women go to the bathroom after having sex.
Sure.
And you pull up your underwear. You're out in the middle of nowhere. You're going to have some leakage there.
Right.
And so that just baffles me. Completely baffles me, because then that throws out everything that he claims that happened tonight.
Yeah.
Michael Otten testified to the chemical matches of the plastic particles, the yellow reflective paint flakes, and the trunk mat fibers. And Stevens did a relatively good job pointing out that urine was not found in the trunk or on the trunk mat, and that the yellow paint flakes couldn't be positively traced to the center lines on Highway 121, although the jury would likely see through this attempt to confuse. It should be noted that during his testimony, he was only really able to testify that fibers, or particles, were similar in chemical composition, color, size, etc., and could never state conclusively that the mat fibers came from Eric's trunk mat, or where the plastic particles originated from, just that everything found was similar. Personally, I found the existence of these small plastic particles on Tammy and in the trunk to be the definitive link between Tammy and Eric and the trunk. And nothing Eric ever stated explained how Tammy could have had those particles on her in an innocent manner. The medical examiners, particularly Dr. Thomas Bennett, did an outstanding job describing the injuries and estimating her time of death based upon stomach contents as being no later than 12:35 a.m., calling into question the defense's timeline of Tammy showing up at the Pump and Stuff gas station around 1 a.m. However, given the relatively bizarre injuries, it was difficult to positively determine any kind of intentional injury at the hands of Eric Stukel, and Dr. Brad Randall might have actually harmed the case somewhat during his testimony. He had a very hard time with some of the suggestive questions. For instance, he described the linear scrapes on the back of Tammy's hands that, to me, seemed like drag marks, but the prosecution really wanted those to be made out to look like defensive wounds, and although he did testify they could be, he seemed rather hesitant to do so, and was very acknowledging to the defense cross-examination. For example, during cross-examination, Stevens asked the following, quote, "When you examined her body, the injuries that you saw that you've described here today, those did not appear to you, did they? That would indicate that she's been in any kind of fight or struggle, did it?" Randall replied, quote, "Not in and of themselves, no." End quote. Dr. Bennett took things a lot further for the prosecution, stating that the blow to her head would be the equivalent of falling 40 feet flat onto a rock, which seemed like a gross mischaracterization of her injuries, and that it would have been a rather incapacitating blow to the stomach to result in the bruise to the mesentery. During direct examination, prosecution attorney Arterburn asks the following, quote, "Dr. Bennett, placing or looking at the two injuries together, the injury to the stomach area or the abdominal area and to the neck area, is the scenario suggested by those injuries more likely accidental, or is it more likely something that is not accidental or random set of circumstances?" End quote. Dr. Bennett replied, quote, "These are both quite forceful injuries to fairly protected areas of the body. It is unlikely that these are accidental. It is much more consistent with these are inflicted injuries of a non-accidental nature." End quote. Overall, the state did a relatively good job presenting the medical evidence for their case, trying to present a scenario of an assault to Tammy. But Stevens was also effective for the defense by providing alternate explanations that, in most cases, the medical experts also agreed with. In one bizarre exchange with Dr. Randall, Stevens is addressing the abdominal injury and gets on a roll. Stevens, quote, "You don't know if Miss Haas struck something that would cause that injury or something struck Miss Haas, do you?" Randall, "No, I do not." Stevens, "But as a result of some kind of trauma?" Randall, "Yes." "But you don't know what kind?" Randall, "No, I do not." "Okay, by some kind of blunt object?" Randall, "Yes." Stevens then asks, "She could have fell on a post." Randall says yes. Stevens again, "She could have fell on a big rock." Again, Randall says yes. Stevens asks, "She could have fell on a big branch lying on the ground." Randall responds, "That's possible." Stevens again, "All right. Isn't it true that even her own head could have caused that injury?" Randall responds, "It could have." By getting Randall on a roll saying yes, he actually gets Randall to admit or state that Tammy's own head could have caused her abdominal injury, although I'm not sure how that could have happened. As the trial progressed, it became apparent reading it that the state was having success putting Eric and Tammy together, and Tammy in the trunk of the car, poking holes in the alibi, but a difficult time getting beyond that and into the territory that Eric must have killed her in some way. Clearly something happened to Tammy, but they didn't know what exactly happened and had to rely on innuendo and suggestions. And apart from having one witness give the opinion that Tammy's death likely occurred in Cedar County, Bill Howland's foreshadowing of the jury having to put the pieces together is what they would have to do. Seemingly nobody knew what happened, how it happened, why it happened, or where it happened. Just that something happened. And the only person the evidence pointed to was Eric Stukel. When the prosecution rested its case after presenting a tenuous narrative, Mike Stevens made a motion for a directed verdict. In essence, it is an argument that the state did not prove its case, and it is a motion by the defense to dismiss the charges. Prior to the defense presenting their case, a closed-door meeting was held between Judge Redmond and opposing counsel. Eric's attorney, Mike Stevens, began the discussion. Stevens, quote, Your Honor, at this time the defense would move for a directed verdict in this case, and we feel the state has failed to come even close to the burden of proof that it has. I'd like to point out 3 or 4 things to the court that I think makes this case very appropriate for the granting of such a motion. First of all, there's been absolutely no evidence, or as the court knows, of a manslaughter charge of the 2 potential parts of it. First of all, that her death was the result of a sudden quarrel. We have absolutely no evidence whatsoever that would indicate that the parties were arguing, that there had been a sudden quarrel. In fact, all the testimony was absolutely to the contrary, that everything was going well, that there was no arguing, fighting, that everybody was having a good time. So we don't feel that there's any evidence as far as the sudden quarrel is concerned. Now, the second aspect of it is we don't feel that there's been any evidence that Eric did anything. He was not in the commission of any kind of crime when Ms. Haas's death occurred. The testimony is that both pathologists testified that in their opinion, they were not able to tell, number one, whether or not the death was accidental or whether or not it was intentional. And so in this instance here, we don't feel. There hasn't been any testimony that Mr. Stukel was involved in the commission of a crime. And so the injuries that she may have had could have very well have been the result of a pedestrian accident. It could have been the result of a fall. We don't have, there's no clear cut by any stretch of the imagination that there was anything that was done, intentionally done in this matter here. Thirdly, we really believe that there hasn't been any evidence that this death even occurred in Nebraska. I asked every one of the experts and so-called experts, law enforcement, whether or not they knew where Tammy had died, and every one of them said they did not know. Now, Mr. Hilligus gave an opinion, but we're not here on an opinion basis, and his opinion was based upon Dr. Bennett's testimony, and Dr. Bennett specifically said he didn't know where she died. Dr. Bennett's time of death that he gave on the death certificate was based upon the information that he'd received that Ms. Haas had been seen in Yankton at 1:30 a.m., so he put the time of death at 2 with somebody that they had seen in South Dakota. And so we feel from the standpoint there's not been any evidence presented that proves that this woman died in the state of Nebraska. And so we feel that from the standpoint that we believe that there's a real jurisdictional problem in this matter. The testimony by the state lab is that they feel that she did not die in the location that they found her. So consequently, the body had to have been moved. And we don't know moved from where. As the court knows, the documents that have been filed in this matter, the state themselves, admit that the death occurred in an unknown location. Now, they say Cedar County, but I don't know how they can know that it's Cedar County or if it's Nebraska or where it may have been. So in this instance here, Your Honor, I really think that the court, even though it would be a tough decision from the standpoint of maybe the politics, not politics involved, but in the motion of it being involved, that we shouldn't be spending another minute here. We shouldn't be spending another dollar of the county's money in this case for the amount of evidence that was presented by the state. And so I asked the court to grant our motion for a directed verdict. End quote. The state's response was rather short and sweet. Your Honor, unless the court has specific questions of me, I will not go into each of these elements. I know the court has been taking notes of all the evidence it's gone through, and the court is well aware of the evidence in this case. Your Honor, the state has presented its prima facie case. We have met the burden that we were required to meet, and the motion for a directed verdict is not appropriate at this time. Unless the court has further questions, I have no further argument. At this time, a private meeting at the bench between court and counsel convened off the record, followed by Judge Redmond overruling the objection and asking the defense to proceed with its defense, and the defense would have to present its side. And their first witness would be Eric Stukel. Here's Haas' family friend, Gary Itt, who was there for the entire trial.
We were in great anticipation, had no idea which way it would go for sure. You know, we were told by the prosecution even before the trial began as a 50-50. You know, so they were not that positive about it. So we knew it was a tough case, but my personal feeling, listening to all the testimony, following the evidence, that there was sufficient evidence to find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And so I was about 80% sure, because there's always that question. And the defense attorney, Mike Stevens, obviously did his work and you know, put some questions out there. And of course, the key questions were, which even leading to the verdict, we knew that they read the instructions in court, and I tried to write them down, you know, but one of the key instructions was where she died. And that I knew for any of us that listened to the evidence, it wasn't presented clearly. You know, it wasn't, you know, an absolute thing. They've got evidence that it occurred in this location, and that's where she died. We know where her body was found. We know, you know, after the fact. And so I didn't know what that meant for sure, because I didn't know any of the jury members. But I did think, I kind of felt that it might not go the way we had hoped for with a guilty verdict.
After 21 witnesses all painting a grim picture for Eric, how would the defense respond? This was attorney Mike Stevens' first case of this kind. Would he hit it out of the park, leading to an acquittal? Or would the state fail to prove its case? The defense presents its case, and the verdict comes on the next episode of the Footsteps in the Dark podcast, Season 1, Tammy Haas.
There was a period of time where I thought, he fucking did it. I mean, her body was in his car. There had to have been some kind of a connection, whether he did do it or he helped out with it. Yeah, he's got an alibi from his sister.
The kid's attitude during the whole trial, the few days that I was there, he was cocky and acted like, it just pissed the guy off just looking at this kid. Well, I've totally believed the whole time that his sister gave him an alibi, and I believe she was lying the whole time.
The defense put me on the stand to degrade her character.
We sat there waiting for the verdict. As the jury's members came in, the one thing I noticed, there were two of the ladies that were crying, and the others were pretty stoic. And so I didn't know what that meant for sure, because I didn't know any of the jury members. But I did think, I kind of felt that it might not go the way we had hoped for with a guilty verdict. And so when the verdict was announced,
Oh, believe me, I've gone on my little journey of self-discovery, especially after the trial, because after the trial and that verdict came back, that was the end, really, for me, as far as, in a way, in my world, there's right and wrong, good and bad, and it just didn't make sense to me that he got acquitted. And thank God I, at the time, had a boyfriend and a good friend that were like, you need help.
How do you remember Eric's demeanor in court? Was he pretty controlled through it?
Yeah, for the most part, except for that little emotion. Well, what is it's a relief thing? I can't figure it. It was just it was an out.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
exasperated relief.
Exasperated.
What was Nancy like? Were you sitting next to Nancy at that time?
All of you have been trying to say that for 30 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Although Tammy's case has grown cold, that doesn't mean that it's closed. The FBI and Yankton Police Department continue to seek information in the death of Tammy Haas. If you have information, you have options. Call the FBI's Sioux Falls Resident Agency at 605-334-6881, the Yankton Police Department at 605-668-5210, submit a tip at tips.fbi.gov, or lastly, send us a message. Someone knows what happened to Tammy, and maybe you know how to help solve the mystery. This podcast was written and produced by me, your host, Chad Zimmerman. The song featured in the trailer, Tammy's Ghost, was written and features John Slapp on vocals, guitar, and bass, Matt Gedney on guitar, Adam Jones on drums, and Laura Egan and Carl Graber on horns.